Greetings, and welcome to Beatles Stuffology. We're two old friends sit around to talk BS, Beatles stuff, on a track-by-track basis, pretty much for the sake of it. My name is McQuarrie, and I'm here with my co-host, Andrew Deacon. Say hi, Andrew.
Now then.
Excellent timing for a Jimmy Savile impression. Thank you for that.
Wonderfully bad taste. Hello, how are you?
Wow,
It's relevant, folks. It is relevant. You've worked it out. You're a Beatles fan. You listen to this podcast. You know why the words now, then. I nearly said the word and in between are relevant at this point. It's just the first thing that popped into my head, and I apologise absolutely wholeheartedly. How are you, JG?
well, I was fine until about 30 seconds ago. Yeah.
Did you find that slightly disarming?
It's disorienting, I think is the word. Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough.
Lovely,
Fair
great.
enough.
Well, we're
Yeah.
off to a flying start. Well, this week we're normally talking about Kansas City, hey. But inevitably, there's something that we need to talk about first. We have new Beatles material to talk about. How wonderful to be in the middle of a Beatles podcast and have a new Beatles single come out, right?
Isn't it interesting? I mean, we should say, context. We're recording this on the 11th of November, so it's been out for about 9 days. Because it's the 2nd of November it came out, but this is our first opportunity to have a chat. Although I should point out that if we were being steadfast and true to our core principles, we would not be reviewing this or talking about it at all until after we'd finished talking about every other Beatles release, which I have calculated is probably going to be towards the latter end of this decade.
Excellent. Good. Core principles and beliefs. I'm terribly sorry, but I think you've mistaken me for someone else.
Have you not read our charter?
Well, I read the mission statement and a précis.
And anyway, is it a Beatles release?
Yes. That's
yes, it's a Beatles release, but is it a Beatles release?
Yes, it is. It's a Beatles song. I don't have an awful lot of patience for people who are sort of saying that it's not actually a Beatles song, or it's not actually it is. They're all on it. It's released by the Beatles. It's credited to the Beatles. It's released on their record label. It's a Beatles song. You don't have to like it. You don't have to think it's a good one or not. But it is definitely a Beatles song. If the two remaining surviving members of the band say it is. It is. That's pretty much the end of the conversation, I think.
I take the view it's Schrodinger's Beatles. It's both the Beatles and not the Beatles, and as long as you don't look too closely, it can be whatever you want it to be. That's perfectly fine. But a thought occurred to me this morning, actually, that effectively you could take any song that was written by one of the former Beatles, and then admittedly you wouldn't be able to do it for all four, but then get contributions from the two surviving Beatles. And then, hey presto, we could have another Beatles release. And the one that actually occurred to me, I was sort of going back to Get Back and think, well, actually, during that, you see George introduce All Things Must Pass. And so therefore, you sort of think, well, actually, potentially it was written with the Beatles in mind. So maybe Olivia could say to Paul and Ringo, hey, do you want to have a go at re-recording this? And we could, with a bit of support maybe, and turn it into something that is a vaguely Beatlesy release. Now, I realise that's never going to happen, and I wouldn't want it to happen, quite frankly. But the thought that occurred to me was at least that was a song that was written with the intention of it being a Beatles song. It was presented to the Beatles as one of, what would you think if we could record this? Whilst I cannot speak of the mindset of John Lennon in, was it 77? 77 when he wrote the demo, I doubt very much that it was ever intended to be something that he would sort of say to Paul, hey, let's sit down and record this. So, there's an element there where I think the naysayers, potentially have a point, but on the other hand, they're killing everybody's fun and they should just shut up.
I mean, I suppose it depends how much weight you want to put on the story that the tapes were labeled for Paul. So when Yoko gave them to Paul, his intention was that Paul would be able to listen to them sing them. I mean, they had reached a rapprochement in 77. The question is if Lennon hadn't been murdered in 1980, would they have gone back to working together? Probably. Would there have been the opportunity to work on this song? Also possibly. But if John recorded them and specifically left them with a for Paul note on them, then I also think it's fair to say it the other way. Say, well, it kind of sounds like he did have the intention of doing that. But then,
But did
do
he
you?
though?
Did he though? Exactly. That's the
Did he
question.
though? Did he though? Really? It's a nice story,
It is
isn't
a
it?
nice story. It
It's
would
a
be
nice
lovely
story,
if it was
and
true, but who
you
knows?
are you are putting a lot of speculation on top of hypothesis, and postulation. Think I may have just invented a word there, but all of that is so completely hypothetical that I think you just have to then strip it back and say, well, let's just look at what it is rather than thinking about what it isn't. And I think that's also another thing. People have developed their own narrative. There's really been this key focus, hasn't there, on talking about how much the words relate to the situation, and is it his feelings for Paul and all of that sort of thing. And you say, well, okay, I'm going to go with two bits of speculation here. One is it's unlikely, bearing in mind the relationships he was in at the time. It's more likely to be to one of the two women that he was particularly close to at the time. I can't remember the chronology of where he was in his relationships at that point. But two, and this is as listeners to this podcast, if there are any regular listeners, hello, will know they could just be words. They could just have been those guide words that he got down on a piece of paper to hone the melody. I don't know how much they were worked on and they were crafted. They're relatively simplistic. Doesn't mean they're not effective, but they're relatively simplistic. And because they're so simplistic, it allows people then to ascribe their own meaning and their own narrative to them. They're just a bunch of nice words, I think, that seem to fit. Maybe he would have done with more at the time. Maybe he had something in his head that they meant. But I think people maybe just need to appreciate the fact that there's a pleasant bunch of words in there, and stop looking for things that almost certainly aren't there.
I think as far as the lyric goes, the problem is that we don't really have anything else to compare it to because he wasn't really writing or releasing music in 1977. So, okay, there's a handful of demos which have ended up as Beatles singles, but there's nothing else that we can really compare it to say, well, what else could we look at to see whether we can draw from other material and work something out. It's going to be 3 years before Double Fantasy is released, and Double Fantasy doesn't really connect much to this song particularly. I mean, Double Fantasy is a great album, but it's not really anything to do with this. And so the question is therefore, the only lyric we know that would have been worked on specifically, I suppose, is Paul's bits. Paul would have found something to craft that would fit with Lennon's lyric, and I think sort of relatively successfully. I've got to say, his parts don't feel particularly intrusive compared to the original, but they also have the same kind of very sort of open question approach, if you like, to meaning, which is they are also extremely simplistic. They're not. They're not. They're not trying to do that tugging on the heartstrings in the way that what is it? Whatever happened to the life that we once knew? Could we really live without each other? In Free as a Bird. I mean, they're sort of vaguely in the same direction, but they're much more open, and I think much more effective as well. So yeah, the whole lyric is it's pleasingly open ended, and it's. I understand why people want to say, oh well, is the subject of the song Paul, because that's a nice thought. Like I
Yeah.
said, they'd reached rapprochement. They were getting on. They had jammed it together at this point at Harry Nilsson's house, I think, in Los Angeles. And it's nice to think that that's the case. But it could be about May Pang. It could be about Yoko. It could be about any number of things, and there isn't enough in the lyric to be able to nail down that degree of specificity.
But that's what makes it universal.
Yeah,
And that's
absolutely,
what
of course.
allows people to do it. And that's fine. It is going to be whatever they want it to be. And the marketing to an extent has contributed to that
Mm.
as well, and including the Peter Jackson accompanying montage. But we'll get onto that in a bit, because I think actually someone might have got 8 to 10 minutes into this and thought, well, they all sound a bit cynical towards it. And what we haven't really done is sort of said what we like, I actually find it quite difficult because I find that I always have to caveat it, by comparing it, and obviously it you can and you can't compare it to Beatles singles, songs of the past, because whilst it is a Beatles song, you've got no idea what the Beatles would sound like if they were recording as a unit today, should they all still be alive. But I think one thing that's interesting for me is what I can't hear in it is anything coming from a specific period. So I kind of think it's timeless, not necessarily in a hey man, it's an absolute classic kind of thing, but more in a sense that I don't feel like it comes from any specific era. And that's just in exactly the same way as I think Free as a Bird and Real Love sound as though they're straight out of 1988 and 1989, precisely because to me they sound more like Jeff Lynne produced songs than they do Beatles songs. And I think that's a big difference. So the relative absence of Jeff Lynne on this allows the character of the song and the performances to come through in a way that I think they didn't on Free as a Bird and Real Love.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair, and I'll come out and say this song is noticeably better produced than either "Free as a Bird" and "Real Love," and I think it's probably better than either of those as well.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Which is kind of interesting. I know, there's a whole thing about George saying it was fucking rubbish, and it's not really clear whether he was talking about the song itself or the technical qualities of the recording. But either way, I'll come out and also say I just like it. It is a grower. I think it's got a nice, slightly keening, slightly melancholy and regretful air to it, which is very, very pleasing. It doesn't have any of the acidity that much of Lennon's pre-Double Fantasy works have. But then again, it is also just a demo, so who knows if he'd finished it, what it would have ended up being like. But it's sweet and it's affectionate and rather charming, and I am genuinely very pleased with it. It's much much better than I was expecting it to be, and once all the kerfuffle about artificial intelligence and all that nonsense had died down, in the end, it's just a pleasing song. It's not going to be one of their all-time classics, but it's not Mr. Moonlight either. So that's a win.
I think one of the things that did capture me was the fact that there is a sense of pace to it as well.
Mm.
And again, another one of those off repeat things on here is about actually they the Beatles play everything with great gusto. It's almost so almost everything could potentially have the pace and the oomph of a live song. And although there is that very sort of delicate introduction, it really gets into its stride quite quickly, and then sort of develops that sense of momentum. And I think that's something that really works, and something that is no way as forced as the singles that accompanied Anthology
I think one of
were. So
I think one of the reasons for that, and you can probably guess where this is going.
Jeff Lynne.
No, no, well, yes, I mean that's absolutely true, because Jeff Lynne isn't there, and Jeff Lynne makes everything sound static and stagnant,
Lumpy.
lumpy. But I think in a way it benefits from being a long time since Anthology was completed, because one of the things I think is most successful about Now and Then is Ringo. And one of the reasons I like his playing on this is that he is, I think, infusing that kind of energy, that pace, gusto, if you to use your word, in the song. And I think on Anthology, and particularly on Freezer Bird and Real Love, Ringo sounds like he's doing a bit of a Ringo impression. Now, I don't know whether that's the way that Jeff Lynne is producing him, or maybe is sort of directing him to play in a particularly kind of like, here comes the classic Ringo style. But on Now and Then, he just sounds like a drummer playing to the song rather than somebody doing an impression of themselves, basically. And I think that's to immense benefit of the song.
Well, the story's not that Jeff Lynne would insist that he played with a click track.
I think that sounds like the sort of thing that Jeff Lynne would do, and that's
Yeah,
sort of the thing that Ringo would kind of rail
yeah.
against. Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's really difficult to judge it against things that have gone before, because I'm not as sold on the what say the harmonizing, the kind of the as other people seem to be, because I'm not really hearing anything that's particularly distinctly Beatley in my eyes. There, it's effectively it's people singing along together, but then it doesn't really matter, because as we've said before, they're not trying to copy stuff they've done in the past. They're just trying to rework a demo and produce something that has all of them on. And I think that move away from effectively parodying themselves, which again I think was a trap they fell into with potentially with something like Free as a Bird, I think is really beneficial. The only place in which I don't think it works, and again this is purely subjective, is in that guitar solo. And I know it's been said that it's meant to be, Paul said it's like a tribute to George. But then, and maybe this is because we've obviously been listening to a lot of the early stuff recently, but it doesn't really feel like a George solo. It's not busy enough. It's not as I, it's not as interesting, as varied as the kind of thing that George would play. It sounds just a little too simplistic.
That's not unfair. I mean, George was the best guitarist in the Beatles, and McCartney is an unbelievably gifted musician, but George was a better guitar player, and I don't think Paul would disagree with that. And certainly, I know that John wouldn't. John often said that George was easily the best guitarist in the Beatles. But I think it's a much better guitar solo than the one on Free as a Bird. Because but I also want to clarify that, because I think the guitar solo in Free as a Bird is fantastic, but it sounds absolutely fuck all like the Beatles. It just sounds like a really great George Harrison solo guitar. Solo guitar solo, you know what I mean. It's a great piece of work, but it just doesn't have anything in common with the song. And as is again sort of typical of Jess Lynne's production style, it sits on top of the track rather than feeling integrated. I definitely agree that McCartney's solo in this is much more simplistic than you would probably get, or much more, maybe not even simplistic, but it's not as subtle as George would manage. But it is much better produced, and it sits within the track much better than George's actual solo on Free as a Bird.
Oh, okay, that's interesting because it felt like it was going in a different way to the melody to me. It felt like it was kind of going against the things that have come before. So
Mm.
it didn't work as well for me. But that's perfectly fine. All opinions are valid. Well, some of them clearly aren't, and there are a lot of opinions around, aren't there?
It's
There are a
not
lot,
hard to find opinions on this, no.
it's not, and there are lots of people who very very quickly manage to get their breakdowns of the song, their videos of their reactions, and their breakdowns of the song and their comparisons to the demo version out on YouTube. I mean, I realise that we're sort of guiltily adding to this, and we're approaching 20 minutes already. But by my word, some people were quick off the mark, and they've got hundreds of thousands of views already, which I'm not contributing to. But I thought it was very, very interesting, and in particular, there were lots of opinions about, and I think it's because the marketing machine worked so well. There were lots of opinions about the release. And there were lots of opinions about the fact that there was no news about the release for months on end when they thought there was going to be news. It really built up the tension. Then we found out when it was going to be, and then we saw the cover, and loads of people then went, oh, so it was really weird. It was like, oh, is that here? Like covers really matter these days anyway, and it's okay, it's fine. There's probably a reason for it. It doesn't matter. The back of it has some link to George and all of that sort of thing. It's fine. And then there was the one show thing on BBC. Then there was the 2 p.m. release on whatever day it was, and everything embargoed up till then. And I don't know where you listen to it. I was listening on BBC Six Music, and it was really cringeworthy because as much as I like Craig Charles, and there is a Liverpool link, obviously, I'm not overly sure he knew a great deal about the Beatles, and he certainly hadn't really been given much info on the AI element of it as well. But it didn't really matter because when you listen to it, you just thought, oh, okay, yeah, that's all right. Because I know before, I can't remember what episode it was, but we had made reference when I think the news originally came out to the demos that you can hear if you sort of scour the internet, and it really didn't sound like it was that inspiring a song. So they've done really, really well with it. And part of that is also taking out the Lennon middle eight as well, which just wouldn't have worked at all, I think. So although you pretty much get verse, chorus, guitar solo, verse, chorus, it's no less effective for that. But the marketing machine has been incredibly efficient at generating opinions on this to the point where it's, isn't it, the biggest selling thing in this period rather than that period ever in the last 6 years or something? I don't know. It's number one
I believe that it is, yeah. But don't ask me
biggest selling
don't ask me
vinyl
to quote the.
single of the last 20 odd years, despite the fact that for a lot of those years people weren't buying vinyl singles. Most download something or other, um, with the exception of, I don't know, I was going to say random act. I'm not even going to bother there, but you know what I mean. It's
Yeah.
it has done phenomenally well.
And also the biggest gap between a number one single of any act, 54 years between the Ballad of John and Yoko and Now and Then.
Oh, isn't it? I thought it was biggest gap between first and last, or is it biggest gap between
No, I think it's biggest gap between number
between? Oh,
ones.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. I was going to say because if it was biggest gap between first and last, then I'd be saying, "Oh, come on, Cliff, where's your Christmas single? Let's get that Cliff v the Beatles banter going." That'd be quite funny. Speaking of that sort of band rivalry, I have to say we normally talk about cover versions of songs that the Beatles have recorded. Now you might think it's quite difficult to talk about cover versions of songs of now and then, but it's not. And this is due to AI. I was listening earlier to an AI generated version of Oasis as they would be if they were playing now and then. And I think it's pretty special, actually. I think it's really reminiscent of some early Oasis B-sides. And that's actually a compliment because Oasis had some really good B-sides. And I think it's certainly much better than the AI generated 1964 Beatles version of Now and Then, which is not great, with the one exception, and this links back to something you said. The drumming in the chorus is so reminiscent of those kind of frenetic drum patterns that Ringo would put in on, say, the chorus of Hard Day's Night. When the mood really shifts and suddenly you've got something incredibly expressive and frenetic, and he's just hammering away at an almighty rhythm. They've got that down. So AI's picked up that, but apart from that, it's a slight anticlimax.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
But worth a listen. Definitely worth a listen. Should we mention the Peter Jackson video?
I mean, we probably should, but it's crap. So I mean, I don't really know what else to say about it. It's really cheesy and not in a particularly fun way. Like you mentioned, the song itself sounds timeless because it doesn't sound like it's one specific era. However, George is very clearly lifted from the "Hello Goodbye" video, and John Lennon couldn't
Which he
really
hated.
yeah, exactly, which is not great tribute, and Lennon couldn't really look more distinctive if he tried. It's such a weird thing. I mean, like, I'm pleased they didn't try and do like a CGI like old man version of Lennon
Yeah.
or something. So I suppose at least it's actually him. And I know there's virtually no footage of him from 1977 that could be included. So that opportunity is closed down as well. But it's still rubbish. It's not even particularly well done from, the alleged master of special effects, Peter Jackson, and all that. But also, do people, this is a genuine question because I'm phenomenally out of touch. Do people really give a shit about videos anymore? Is that still a thing?
Promotional device. Something to watch on YouTube, isn't it? Or for something that someone could do a breakdown of on YouTube, or see their reaction to. Yeah, yeah. I made a
The
note that
12
said,
minute, sorry, the 12-minute making of is great. That's on YouTube and it's fantastic. I really enjoyed watching that. The video itself,
I noted down the fact that they took George from Hello Goodbye just seemed really, really odd because he looks like he's not enjoying wearing that outfit at all. So it doesn't really feel like a tribute. Um, but the weird thing for me is actually what that and Lennon and his cream jacket kind of accompanies, which is the shots of Ringo and Paul singing.
Yeah.
It's just so, and I've written, and I quote myself here, really, 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 really odd. It almost looks like Ringo's never sung into a microphone in his life before. And they're certainly not in the same room. That has to be a spliced image.
Everything about that scene is just weird and wrong. It doesn't like again. I suppose I understand what they're trying to do, which is all like here's all your disparate elements coming together, blah blah blah. But it's not oh god. It's just I was going to say something about the video to Freeze a Bird, which is really corny, but
Yeah.
it's got a bit of charm to it, and it's upfront about what it's doing. Here's your nostalgia wank for like 4 minutes, enjoy. So it's just a strung together bunch of references. This really seems to think that it's, I don't know, out to achieve something or be a bit special, and it's sort of slightly sub Doctor Who levels of special effects, splicing together
Can I just
footage for
speak
no readily apparent reason.
can I just speak directly to the listener for a second? Listener, can I apologise? JG's been particularly sweary today, and I don't know why. This is quite unusual. We're not really a blue podcast, although swearing is my middle name. But I don't think he's been getting enough sleep. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, I agree. I do agree with what you're saying. I've only really got one thing left that I want to say on this, and we're about to hit the 27-28 minute mark. In that it doesn't sound like they're trying, and that's a good thing because everything I've heard of the new Rolling Stones album really sounds like they're trying very, very hard to be the Rolling Stones and hip and happening, man. And again, subjective opinion. They have their billions of dollars and they're perfectly fine. And they're not going to be affected by little old me. But oh dear, it sounds tired.
I haven't listened to Hackney Diamonds yet. I don't know whether I'll get round to it or not, but yeah, it does sound like it sounds like it's screaming like me.
Hackney Diamonds, hackneyed diamonds, more like.
Excellent work. Right.
Segue.
Yeah, right, yes. And on that note, shall we move on and talk about the song that we are actually meant to be talking about this week?
Hey.
Yes, let's do it. So, Kansas City. Hey. 3 chords, 2 songs, 1 recording. Go.
It's fun. It's fun. I think this is. I think there's a really good McCartney vocal on this, and I think this is what a good Beatles cover should be like. You could sort of stick it there with, yeah, obviously not up there with Twist and Shout and Money, for example. There's been really good examples of powerful rocking covers, and I think it works. I mean, I've got more to say than that, but I think that's a good place to start. And I'm judging from your facial expressions that you may not be on the same page as me.
No, I actually am. My facial expressions are betraying me. I do I do really enjoy, as is always the way. I do really enjoy this cover. It's a nice little shot of energy. I agree with you. I think it's terrific. McCartney vocal. It's interesting that 2 cover versions that you cited there, Twist and Shout and Money, are both Lennon. But this is really McCartney going flat out, and it works incredibly well. It's another one take wonder. They just did it, that was it, moved on with their lives. And in an album that hasn't had a great deal of energy kind of shot through it, I think it's a really necessary thing to be there, because I don't. When I say it doesn't necessarily have a lot of energy to it, I don't necessarily mean that as a criticism. I mean, "I'll Follow the Sun" isn't an energetic song. It doesn't mean it's a bad song or whatever. But it's a quiet little ballad. "Babies in Black" is this sort of weird, sort of 50s kind of waltz time thing. But here we have something which has got a bit of strength, a bit of power, and it kind of reminds you of what the band are capable of doing. Even rock and roll music, I'd stand by our criticism of that as a cover version. It should have achieved the same thing, but it kind of doesn't. This is a much, much stronger cover version.
So I mean, the interesting thing, just for people who've not listened to that episode, you should listen to it because we kind of I make the case that it's not even a particularly good Chuck Berry song. Um, but what we've got here is, fairly solid, good songwriting, Lieber Stoller, and actually then you've got that sort of craft and inventiveness of Little Richard, who put these two songs, or his own composition, together with Kansas City in order to build something that was more than the sum of its parts. And I believe that the Beatles actually watched Little Richard perform this medley, and then they took that rather than take the one song and think, oh, what should we do? Let's put it with this. They saw it already being done like this and performed it, which again is very much in line with the Beatles covers that we've talked about before. There's not a huge amount of invention, but what there is real craft and skill and energy in terms of the performance. And I think that's fascinating in itself. I mean, it was something that did appear in the live act. It then got dropped. It did come back into the live set at one point, but we'll talk about that in a moment. But it's just such a good song. And I don't really kind of understand why someone might look at this and think, well, it's not one of their best, or it's not one of those great cover versions. I think this song's probably been sort of lurking in the back of their minds for a while. One thing I said when we did the episode on Little Child was that I kind of forgot that it was actually it wasn't a cover version. And I think when they were writing Little Child, I suspect that they were inspired by certain bits, certainly in terms of the rhythm and the pace and the power of something like Kansas City, because I think there are similarities between the two. So it's a song that they've lived with. It's a song that they clearly like and have fun playing and can do quickly as well. So you know what? I think it works as that kind of uplift. Now we're getting to the end of side one that this record desperately needs.
Absolutely, and it gives you a reason to flip over to side two. You actually have a conclusion to the first side. It doesn't just stop or end. That's incredibly important as well. And everybody feels really engaged in this as well. Again, a couple of the other songs we've talked about in side one, I don't know that that's necessarily always been the case. I mean, No Reply and I'm a Loser, yes, but much of the rest of it, I don't know. It's a bit hither and thither. He says, desperately trying to avoid BS bingo. It's just nice to have a song where everybody feels like they're throwing themselves at it with the energy and vivacity that it requires. And even Lennon's slightly sarcastic backing vocals in the hey 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 section, just like they don't feel mean spirited or sour or anything like that. They're just quite funny.
Yeah.
And it's nice, and it doesn't undercut McCartney, who's still going flat out. It's a great little addition, and it shows how effective that side of Lennon can be when it's used in that kind of way.
Yeah. So what is it about songs about places, and in particular, I think American places, that sound so much better than the actual place themselves? Because if we were going to sort of do a list of the 30 best American cities to go and visit as a tourist, Kansas City's not going to make it. And I gather as well, I just doing a little bit of reading, that Lieber Stoller, neither of them, before they wrote the original, which was called Kansas City Lovin', it was the original title, neither of them had actually been to Kansas City. But there's clearly something about the image that those names create that have that kind of impact.
Yeah, it was same with Detroit as well. I don't think anybody's probably going to be sorry to any Detroit listeners. I don't mean to put your city down, but I do believe it does have some ongoing issues at the moment. I don't know that it would necessarily top out anybody's list of first choice tourist destinations. But Detroit is a great word, and it's a fun word to sing. And honestly,
There you go.
it might just come down to that. Same with Kansas. It's got that dung dung. It's got a good like punch to it.
Maybe the plosive of the K and then the rhythm of the S sounds from SAS and city.
Exactly.
That sort of yeah, that probably has an effect as well.
I don't know if you
Maybe
get the
that's
same with I'm going to Sheffield City. I don't know whether it would have the,
well,
but maybe it
well.
would. I don't know.
I was going to say maybe it was those sounds that inspired Level 42 to write their seminal early 80s classic Kansas City Milkman. I don't know, but it's weird how the places do have that impact, isn't it? I mean, because one of the other great songs about the state of Kansas, although of course I know Kansas City is in both Missouri and in Kansas. Right, little aside there. The other one of the other great songs about Kansas is the phenomenal Wichita lineman.
Absolutely.
And Wichita, what heck kind of word is Wichita? I was wondering, I sort of originally started thinking, and the more you think about this, then the deeper it gets. Surface level thinking is best for this. Because I was thinking, are there any songs about, Hebden Bridge, Whitley Bay, Eastbourne, or the Isle of Thanet? Or were there any? But they wouldn't sound as as
I don't know.
romantic.
Thanet's a great word.
As some of those, as nice as some of those places are. But then, of course, you get into it. Well, all right, we've got Waterloo Sunset, and although it doesn't mention a place, it's about a place. You're Homeward Bound. I mean, it doesn't mention it in the title. I think it does mention it in the song. Fog on the. I then came up with a list, and some of them are really quite dour, but some of them work. Fog on the Tyne. I Don't Want to Go to Chelsea. One of Morrissey's least interesting choruses, Dagenham Dave, Dagenham Dave, Dagenham Dave. And then thought, oh, Wuthering Heights. What an amazingly evocative song about, but it's not as romantic as Kansas City sounds. Eddie Grant's going to rock down to Electric Avenue in Brixton, but it's not as evocative. And then we get into good old fashioned Wing song, London Town.
Thank you.
I'll give them Mull of Kintyre.
That's kind of you.
I didn't do a little bit of Googling. Those were just ones that came off the top of my head. But I was reminded of a list that Bob Stanley came up with for the Times. Bob Stanley gets mentioned here a lot, and that was the awesome Chas and Dave song Margate. Right, down to Margate, love that. And then of course, how could I forget? Captain Sensible's classic Croydon?
Well, yes.
It mentions going to Stanley Tech, which, okay, wasn't a school that I went to, but it was pretty darn close. And one of the ones that we occasionally had little interactions with, for example. But they're not evocative in the romantic sense. They're evocative more in some of these in the nostalgic sense. And I think that sort of makes a difference.
I'm impressed that you managed to mention Fog on the Tyne, but somehow Ferry Across the Mersey seems to have slipped your mind.
Yeah, I know. That should have come up, shouldn't it? But
Yeah.
well, yeah. And actually, this morning I was listening to here's a tangent. The Bangles cover of "I'm Going Down to Liverpool," which because my brother had that Bangles album. I can't remember which one it was. But nominally, that album cover is also meant to be like a parody of, or pastiche of Hard Day's Night in the way that the photos are arranged, although it's very different stylistically. And but I'm Going Down to Liverpool is quite an interesting song for a couple of reasons. Firstly, you wouldn't expect the Bangles to be singing about being unemployed in Liverpool and having nothing to do. But secondly, it's actually a cover of a song from early 80s new wave band, latterly Eurovision winners even, The Waves, as in Katrina and the Waves. That was interesting. Even then, the member of Katrina and the Waves, or the Waves at that point, that wrote that song, I've forgotten his name now, Kimberly, but I can't remember the surname, was previously a member of the Soft Boys with Robin Hitchcock. And you just think, so many rabbit holes that you can go down in this, that just to sort of to go back slightly earlier in the episode, that now and then kind of takes you away from, because so many of these really interesting things and connections that I hadn't considered with some of these songs before. I love delving back into those and listening to me. I have a very cursory knowledge of the Soft Boys. So then start having a listening to some of that, and then it's kind of have your mind blown and then go in other directions. And the Robin Hitchcock angle is obviously, quite useful for us because we're also big fans of REM. So there's all these things that are going on, and all of this started with you and me sitting down and saying, okay, well, the next one we're going to talk about is Kansas City, Hey, Hey, Hey.
Yeah, that's where it goes. It's also interesting that you're sort of saying British voices wouldn't necessarily conjure up the same romanticism or the same kind of imagery as American places. But of course, until the Beatles, the cultural convection currents only ran in one direction, and they ran from America to the United Kingdom. The Beatles were the first ones to break that down, obviously, but it never quite the same thing never really worked in reverse. So you don't get a lot of that.
Some time.
You get bits of it with kind of 66 and Carnaby Street, but
you
it's
get
not
the
quite the
generic,
same.
American arriving in London, and London Calling playing. London Calling gets used a lot.
Yeah,
it
yeah.
is such a TV and film trope that's really, really irritating.
It's even made it into a Bond film.
Did it really?
Yeah, yeah. Although it was Die Another Day, so if nobody remembers that, that's entirely understandable.
Okay, fair enough. Is that a Piers Brosnan Nan film? Or...
yeah, it's his last one.
Okay,
it's the one Madonna's in. Let's just leave it at that, shall we?
It's the one what?
It's the one Madonna's in.
Okay, I think I've just proved that I've never seen that one.
You're not missing it much.
Fair enough. So the Kansas City in itself is interesting in relation to this, because I mentioned earlier that it dropped off the Beatles set list fairly early on. The one time it was then brought back in was the one time they played in Kansas City on the 17th of September 1964, and they opened the gig with it, which in my mind shows a lot of nous, and also shows that they can pick it up at any point. I think there were 32 concerts on that tour, and I think, if I'm correct in the research that I did in this, according to setlist.fm, crowdsourcing, is the only time on the whole tour they played a song with the Beatles.
There you go.
Apologies, Beatles for Sale. Get it right. So didn't pick me up in time on that one. Now, I know that the album wasn't out yet, but they had recorded a significant portion of it, and they hadn't thought of those as being, worthy of sticking in the set list at that point, which I think is worthy of note. The other thing that I think is relatively worthy of note is that it's yet another place the Beatles played that no longer exists. They were playing in the Kansas City Municipal Stadium, and it's now, looking at Street View, a fairly mundane housing estate in Kansas City. But it was a stadium of note. Our American listeners, and we do have, in terms of the listeners we have, a large proportion of our American will know that Jackie Robinson, one of the most famous baseball players of all time, did play a season there in the league that was set up specifically for Black Americans to play in. It's also, bearing in mind that the song does mention, Kansas City Plaza at 12th and Vine. It's about half a mile away from, or a mile and a half away from that place, even though technically, and yes, I have been on Google Maps to check this, technically 12th and Vine don't actually intersect, although there is a kind of like a memorial reference to it now. I get the feeling as well that it wasn't necessarily, it's a weird concept, that one, because at that point they managed to negotiate what's believed to be the highest single fee for any of their concerts at that point. It was a hugely inflated one. But one of the reasons for that was that the owner of the other baseball team that were playing, I think Kansas City Royals at the time, he deliberately negotiated with Brian Epstein for them to fill in a rest day, and so the Beatles actually kind of resented not just that they had one of their few rest days on that tour filled in, but it was obviously traveling a long way to somewhere that was far away from a lot of the other gigs, and that I think Charles Finley was the name of the owner of the team and the stadium. He managed to get everything publicized as being Charles Finley presents the Beatles. So it was almost as though he was trying to use it as his own personal stamp of authority and look at me, aren't I down with the kids? Whether or not he made any money out of it, because I think it was something like $150,000 that they got paid, or rather, NEMS probably got paid for that. Which is a huge amount of money, and I'm sure we could find an online converter. It's probably still not Taylor Swift money, but what is. So there are some interesting little connections there, and again, those rabbit holes that are worth delving into. You can just imagine what the reaction would have been from people in Kansas, and chances are that Paul probably did one of his rambling kind of, "Oh, hello everyone. We're going to do a song that you might know some of the words to," kind of speech at the start. Hadn't quite honed the craftsmanship in terms of the show at that point.
It takes time to learn that stuff. It takes time to learn that stuff.
It does. Yeah. I mean, they'd only been playing live for about 8 years, so yeah. So I mean, I find all of that fascinating, and actually more fascinating than the song, because the song is fun, and that's the crucial part. I mean, we're not going to sort of delve into the lyrics. We could sort of talk about the fact that the hey 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 call and respond bit really is just so much fun and effective, and should have been a real laugh on stage as well. And also the kind of thing that you could probably just keep going and going and going if you were really in the vibe for it. So, it's not an absolute classic. It's strong filler, but it's still filler. But by heck, this album needs a bit of fun.
Absolutely. That sounds very much like we're shuffling our way towards a conclusion around this. So
yeah,
shall we?
Worth pointing out, folks, if you're gonna email in and complain about all the songs that mention places that are blindingly obvious that I've missed, don't bother, because there's 100 million websites that do that kind of thing, and you could carry on for days and days and days, because places are a little bit like love, isn't it? It's just something that people throw in because, as we said earlier, they just sound nice.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of email, and I trust that you'll be happy to go with flawless segueing as always we do in this podcast.
Sure. Did someone really get a hold of us?
Yes, somebody has really got a hold of us. In this case, it is Glenn from Sydney in Australia. Thanks for getting in touch, Glenn. Glenn writes, "Good day. Hope all is well. I am not going to try and do an accent because he is from Australia and I am from Scotland, and I cannot do accents. So we're just going to leave that unless there's a strong demand for me to do an Australian accent in the future, which there will not be." Anyway, Glenn writes, "I've been enjoying the podcast, but I have to say, I'm a Loser was not your best effort. A couple of quick points."
True. Yes. Yeah.
So Glenn says, Lennon is moving to the first-person narrative that has become a hallmark of so much of his best work. This is a fine meditation on the chaos that is his life and the bittersweet feelings of being on top of the world, yet feeling hopelessly inadequate. I don't think Dylan was writing anything as poignantly personal in 1964, though yes, the acoustic guitar strum is heavily influenced by listening to freewheeling a lot. As always, context is everything, a point we would very much agree with, and I'm not too sure whether other cultural reference points he had for such a sad counterpoint to his astonishing success. It is quite brilliant. These are still Beatlemania records. They are still having to work within that template, and hence it is an upbeat fab tune, but balanced with a darker tone, something he's here to repeat soon with help. George's guitar solo and playing, generally, as with all of his Beatles for sale stuff. This is George's twangiest country-stroke rockabilly flavoured album. Yes, it is. And pure Buck Owens / Carl Perkins, and the solo is a motif reflective of the way that he is riffing on the chords, and it is a perfect complement to the tone and feel of the song, and again, for 1964 is fantastic. He did the same solo, he did the same with the solo, as All My Loving, and his work here is equally good, and it really makes the song. Anyway, enough nerding out about Fabs. As I've said, I've been enjoying the podcast, but this one drifted just a tad. Thanks for reading, Glenn. Thanks, Glenn. We really appreciate that you got a hold of us.
Yeah, Glenn, you're absolutely right in terms of that's not necessarily a little secret, Glenn. At one point, it looked like we might have lost the audio for that, and I was pleased because it meant we could have got to re-record it. However, JG was more relieved that we found the audio again, and so that he could edit it into something like a coherent episode. Okay, I think I knew on the day that perhaps that wasn't our finest effort. However, as is fast becoming my favorite word, subjectivity is crucial here, and it's not one that really sings for me. But then that's that personal emotional response. That's fine. I don't think it quite matches the heights of what Dylan was coming up with at that point. Maybe because, as I think one of the things we may have alluded to is the fact that Dylan, of course, is coming up with so much material at that point, whereas of course Lennon is one element of contribution towards a larger whole as well. So there's a bit more pressure on Dylan to hone the craft. And if you look at I can't remember if we said it on the episode, I think the Freewheeling Bob Dylan, he recorded something like 15 or 16 tracks in a day, of which not all even appeared on the album, and he just got in there and got it done. So yeah, that's fine. I thank you for being a listener and getting in touch as well. We really appreciate that. Yeah, but I don't know. Yeah, I'm going to require JG to edit out the last 30 seconds of me stumbling at this point, because now I am just kind of stumbling like we did on the episode. Hooray!
Excellent. What continuity we have. I mean, I agree with all of that. I don't really have much else to add. So let's just give Kansas City a score, and then we can wrap this up as done.
6, please.
6. And we are perfectly matching today. I'm also going to give it 6. It's a fun song. That's great. I'm very happy with it. Time to move on.
That was a high energy end to the episode.
Well,
not much deliberation and debate there.
I'm sorry. It's very difficult for us to argue a point if we've both given something exactly the same score.
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah. Such is life. Oh, well. And as Glenn has, you can really get a hold of us. You can contact us by email. We are BeatlesStuffology@gmail.com. We're on Twitter @Beatles_ology. We are Beatles Stuffology on Instagram. And you can find my blog at www.jgmcquarrie.scot. Please also check out my other podcast, which is Talking Trek to You, where a noob and an expert, apparently me, go through the original Star Trek series episode by episode. Please like, rate, and review us on whatever podcatcher you're using so that more people can find this podcast. And we're very pleased to say that people have been finding our podcast, and thank you to all our new listeners. It's lovely to have you on board. Next episode, it's time to flip the disc and cover 8 days a week. And as always, we hope you're going to join us for it. But until then, keep listening.